At Designer Shoe Warehouse, we believe that shoes are an important part of, well, everything.
From first steps to first dates, from all-nighters to all-time personal bests.
From building pillow forts to building a life.
For all the big and small moments that make up your whole world, DSW is there. And we've got just the shoes. Find a shoe for every you from brands you love at brag-worthy prices at your DSW store or DSW.com.
I earned my degree online at Arizona State University. I chose to get my degree at ASU because I knew that I'd get a quality education, they were recognized for excellence, and that I would be prepared for the workforce upon graduating. To be associated with ASU, both as a student and alum, it makes me extremely proud, and having experienced the program, I know now that I'm set up for success. Learn more at asuonline.asu.edu.
This message comes from Capital One. The Capital One Venture X Business Card has no preset spending limit, so the card's purchasing power can adapt to meet business needs. Plus, the card earns unlimited double miles on every purchase, so the more a business spends, the more miles earned. And when traveling, the Venture X Business Card grants access to over 1,000 airport lounges. The Venture X Business Card. What's in your wallet? Terms and conditions apply. Find out more at CapitalOne.com/VentureXBusiness.
In the very early hours of October 12, 1492, a Castilian sailor by the name of Juan Rodriguez Bermeo thought he had just secured a meal ticket for the rest of his life. Bermeo was manning the lookout atop the small caravel nicknamed the Pinta when he saw the moon glinting off what appeared to be a cliff face. He screamed "land" at the top of his lungs, and his captain, one Martin Pinzon, fired a single Lombard shot to alert the nearby flagship that a shoreline had been glimpsed. The Spanish monarchs who had sponsored this expedition had promised the first man who spotted land a yearly pension of 10,000 maravedis for life. Most sailors living in Castile in 1492 made about 10,000 to 12,000 maravedis a year, earned after potentially dozens of dangerous trips to sea. A man accustomed to the modest life of a sea dog could retire on such a gift. The captain general of this expedition, who was now styling himself the Admiral of the Ocean Sea, was of course the Genoese navigator Christopher Columbus. Just over 2 months earlier, Columbus and his 3 ships had disembarked from the southwestern Castilian town of Palos on a journey few thought would yield much. The ships were fairly ordinary by Mediterranean standards. The Nina and the Pinta were caravels, fast, all-purpose ships with 3 masts apiece. They were roughly 70 feet or 21 meters long and 20 feet or 6 meters wide. They were owned by the brothers Martin and Vicente Pinzon, 2 mariners from Palos who had agreed to captain the vessels under Columbus for a share of the expedition's potential spoils. It's been noted that the nicknames of these 2 little vessels were fairly inauspicious given how famous these ships would eventually become. In those days, the names of ships were not painted on the transoms, so they were usually known by their wharfside designations. These were often dirty jokes between sailors. The name Pinta was probably derived from a family name of one of the previous owners, but it was also a well-known slang term for painted one, a reference to a dockside sex worker. The nickname of the other vessel, officially called the Santa Clara, but known colloquially as the Niña, quite literally meant little girl, which likely had the same sexually charged connotations. The flagship of this fleet was a larger, slower vessel known as a nao. It had originally been dubbed La Galaga, but had earned the nickname Marigalante, which has been translated as Dirty Mary. Unsatisfied with this, Columbus would redub his flagship the far more dignified Santa Maria, or Saint Mary. But despite Columbus's attempts at piety, for some the ships would always be Dirty Mary and the Two Painted Ladies. The first month of the voyage took the sailors on a somewhat familiar route from the coast of Castile southwest to the Canary Islands, at the time the furthest flung outpost of the United Spanish Kingdoms of Castile and Aragon. When the ships started heading due west from the Canaries, they were now truly in the unknown. There they caught what we now know of as the trade winds, a stiff, consistent wind current that flows from east to west across the Atlantic, roughly at the latitude of the Canaries. Interestingly enough, the fact that Columbus was ultimately sponsored by the monarchs of Spain and not the King of Portugal may have inadvertently led to his success. You see, if he had been sponsored by the Portuguese, it's likely that he would have sailed west by way of Portugal's Azores Islands, which are located further north. Had he pursued that route, it's quite possible that he would not have ever found his way to the favorable trade winds. By charting a course by way of the Canaries, Columbus quickly found himself on a wind current taking him west at speed. Still, it would be a solid month at sea before Juan Rodriguez Bermeo would finally glimpse land from atop the Pinta. Now, one of the most enduring legends about this phase of the crossing is that the crew grew restless and many openly fretted about falling off the edge of the world. But of course, this is a myth. As far as we know, there was no talk of a flat Earth on this voyage. If there was a worry, it was more about the likelihood of never returning to Castile. The easterly wind seemed like it would never allow the sailors to properly make their way home. So, Columbus started lying. Well, actually, it's weirder than that. If we can credit Columbus with anything, it's clear that the man had incredible sailor's instincts. His choice of route, although luckily suggested by the Canary Islands, was likely chosen after years of noting wind currents while sailing in the southern latitudes. Columbus managed to navigate across the Atlantic Ocean based on little more than the direction pointed by a magnetic compass and a good feel for the winds and currents. That's impressive. But Columbus did this almost entirely on feel, very rarely employing the more scientific navigation techniques of the era. By 1492, celestial navigation, or determining one's location at sea based on a close observation of the stars, had become more common, especially on Portuguese vessels. Columbus had come on this voyage with the appropriate tools to make these observations, namely a quadrant and an astrolabe. But his diary tells us that he had already crossed the Atlantic Ocean and was in the Caribbean by the time he first tried to attempt a celestial reading. During the crossing, he navigated exclusively using a technique known as dead reckoning. This is a technique that involves making well-informed guesses on your location based on the position where you started, the direction on your magnetic compass, and an estimation of your ship's speed using a knotted rope attached to a buoyant piece of wood. Now, given the fact that Columbus ultimately arrived safely in the Caribbean, it's tempting to say that this was one of the most impressive feats of dead reckoning ever undertaken. Except Columbus's estimates of his location based on his attempts at dead reckoning were terribly wrong. Not only were they wrong, he lied about them to his crew. But, bizarrely, his lies ended up being more accurate than what he believed were his real measurements. Allow me to explain this. It's been said that Columbus kept a real log of his reckonings and an infamous false log that he shared with the crew. Now, many more recent historians have pointed out that the false log was not literally a second written log, but instead refers more generally to the lies that he was saying aloud and that he thought would better placate his crew. Based on Columbus's dead reckoning, the flotilla was moving west at an impressive speed. So fast, in fact, that he worried his crew would lose heart given their great distance from Spain. So he lied about how far he thought they had traveled. For instance, on October 1st, 1492, he noted in his private journal that the ships had traveled 707 leagues from the Canary Islands. Now, this was a generous guess that overlooked some of his earlier entries that actually added up to 675 leagues. But when it came time to announce the distance to the crew, he claimed that the ships had instead only traveled a less daunting-sounding 584 leagues. Now, the irony was that this false number, 584 leagues, was actually far more accurate. The pilot for the Santa Maria had been keeping his own records of the distances traveled, and based on his reckonings, the ships had traveled 578 leagues from the Canaries, which modern experts now believe was an exceptionally accurate guess. Most modern investigators have guessed that by October 1st, the ships had traveled 575 leagues west of the Canaries. So, the crisis that Columbus felt he needed to lie about wasn't really a crisis at all. His bad math had convinced him that he needed to deceive his crew, but if he'd checked his numbers against those kept by the pilot of the Santa Maria, no deception would have been necessary. This kind of thing would prove to be a recurring theme in the Admiral's life. Columbus constantly felt the need to put a publicist's spin on all of his achievements. Everything was coded in a layer of exaggeration that he believed would better ingratiate him with those around him, and most importantly, with his many patrons and investors back in Spain. Many of Columbus's greatest missteps could perhaps be understood as the fallout of him trying to keep up an illusion. When reading the accounts of the voyages, I personally perceive an anxiety in Columbus. An anxiety that he failed, that he wasn't where he was supposed to be, that the numbers he was recording weren't adding up. So he felt compelled to lie, or at least exaggerate what he found. The great irony was that in the Caribbean, he had actually encountered something incredibly significant. An entire hemisphere previously unknown to Europeans, a gateway to two continents, millions of human beings, and rich civilizations. But because this was not what he expected to find, he couldn't let the discovery speak for itself. He thought it needed a spin. He thought he needed to fluff the numbers. Biographer Kirkpatrick Sale would write of Columbus, quote, "It's almost as if he had an imperfect understanding of the line between truth and falsity. Or perhaps, more accurate, he did not consider that distinction morally or logically important, so long as his higher ends were involved." End quote. He lied about big things. He lied about small things. But most of all, Columbus lied to himself. He also needed all the glory. You see, on October 12, 1492, when Juan Rodriguez Bermeo proudly reported to the Admiral that he had been the first man to glimpse the shore from his lookout on the Pinta, Columbus informed him that he was mistaken. He, Columbus, had actually seen the island first, a few hours earlier. He had even mentioned it to the royal steward who was aboard the Santa Maria, but at the time, he simply chose not to raise the alarm. Now, despite the absurdity of this was within Columbus's power as the Admiral to insist on this version of events. He did it all by himself. And so, of course, he, the Admiral, would be collecting the yearly pension. And with that, Columbus quietly cheated a poor sailor out of a modicum of comfort in his life, just to add another feather to his cap. The calculations he later entered into his log would suggest that the Santa Maria was a solid 40 nautical miles away from land at the hour that he allegedly first saw the cliff, making this sighting virtually impossible. In other words, Columbus lied. Now, this petty bit of glory hogging is hardly the worst of Columbus's misdeeds. His statue was not toppled for this one, but perhaps a picture is emerging. If Columbus's first voyage to the Atlantic starts with fudged figures and stolen pensions, then how does it end? Let's find out today on Our Fake History. Episode number 179, Columbus, Part 2. Hello, and welcome to Our Fake History. My name is Sebastian Major, and this is the podcast where we explore historical myths and try to determine what's fact, what's fiction, and what is such a good story that it simply must be told. Before we get going this week, I just want to remind everyone that if you want to listen to an ad-free version of this podcast, you can get it through Patreon. Just go to patreon.com/ourfakehistory and start supporting at $5 or more every month. You will get access to an ad-free feed and all sorts of other great extra content, including dozens of extra episodes. In fact, once this series concludes, I will have a new extra episode out for patrons that will give you a deeper dive into some more historical debates and controversies that I'm not going to have time for in this main series about Columbus. The Columbus research has been deep. There is so much to discuss. So when I get through this trilogy, I will be putting out a new extra episode for the patrons that will be about all the stuff I wasn't able to get to in the main part of the series. So it's a great time to join up for Patreon. That particular extra will be available to anyone supporting at $3 or more, but if you want the full ad-free Patreon experience with all the extras and the special shout-out at the end of the show, then consider supporting at $5 or more. I also want to let everybody know that Our Fake History is about to take a dive into the world of internet video. Can you believe it? Yes, I'm diving headlong into the year 2012. Our Fake History is going to have more of a YouTube presence, and as some of you may have already noticed, I'm on TikTok now. I went to the dark side, everyone. I'm trying it out. So if you're on TikTok, look for me at Our Fake History. And please search out the Our Fake History YouTube channel. Within the next week, I will have the first few Our Fake History videos up there. Hopefully you dig it. Okay, this week we are returning to our examination of the life and contested legacy of Christopher Columbus. As you have hopefully already put together, this is part 2 of what is going to be a trilogy of episodes on the controversial Genoese mariner. In part 1, we set up a ton of context that will hopefully help us hit the ground running in today's episode. So if you haven't heard part 1, then I strongly suggest you go back and give that a listen now. In part 1, I did my best to establish the huge variety of opinion there is when it comes to the question of how Christopher Columbus should be remembered. As we saw over the centuries, opinion has swung wildly back and forth between some fairly extreme poles. Columbus has been celebrated as a Christ-like figure whose achievements are among the greatest in human history. On the other hand, Columbus has been castigated as a genocidal conqueror whose disastrous voyages to the Caribbean have been compared by one author to the atomic bombs dropped on Japan at the end of the Second World War. In my attempt to navigate between these two poles, I tried to lay out some basic facts about the early life and career of Columbus. We spoke about his birth in 1451 in the Italian city-state of Genoa, his early voyages as a merchant on Genoese vessels, his arrival in Portugal in 1477, and his work on Portuguese ships trading as far north as Iceland and as far south as Ghana, where he first indulged in slave trading. Then we looked at his fortuitous marriage to Felipa Perestrello, whose aristocratic family connections gave the ambitious mariner access to the ears of powerful people, to whom he could pitch his plan to sail west across the ocean sea. We left off in the last episode looking at a variety of different traditions concerning how Columbus got the idea to go west. I took on the well-loved historical myth that Columbus was a man of science who proposed a revolutionary, if scandalous, new idea concerning the size and shape of the earth. The legend would have us believe that he was mocked for his audacious claims only to be ultimately proven right by his voyages. Instead, we saw that his proposal concerning the distance of Europe from Asia, inspired by Marco Polo, the fraudulent travelogues of Sir John de Mandeville, and the work of the Florentine astronomer Paolo Toscanelli, was famously wrong. Columbus's mathematical reasoning was not borne out by his voyages. In fact, the voyages just proved how wishful his original calculations had been. When we last left Columbus, the King of Portugal had just rejected his proposal to sail west. What was worse, Columbus felt compelled to leave the country after his wife's family got caught up on the wrong side of an intrigue in the Portuguese court. The next 7 years would prove to be exceptionally difficult for Christopher Columbus. Not long after leaving Portugal, his wife, Felipa, died, and many of her formerly helpful family connections found themselves out of favor at the Portuguese court. But what's remarkable is how devoted Columbus remained to his grand plan to attempt a voyage to the Indies by a westerly route. In these years, he could have gone back to work, toiling away as a merchant sailor like he'd done for most of his life. But instead, he spent those years tailing the Spanish court, which at that time was constantly on the move around the country. Now, I've been casually tossing around the term Spain to describe that particular political entity, but I think I need to clarify that a little bit. The place that we think of as the modern nation of Spain was, in the late 15th century, just coming into being, thanks to a union between two of the Iberian Peninsula's largest kingdoms, Castile and Aragon. The marriage of Queen Isabella of Castile and King Ferdinand of Aragon, and the establishment of their co-monarchy, had created a powerful alliance that set the stage for what would eventually be a united Spain. In 1492, the same year that Columbus famously crossed the Atlantic, Ferdinand and Isabella's forces forced the surrender of Granada, the last Moorish stronghold on the Iberian Peninsula. This concluded a centuries-long struggle between the Christian and Muslim kingdoms in the region, known to the Christians as the Reconquista. So Spain was very much becoming a thing at that time, and many historians are comfortable using the term Spain to describe the political entity that Columbus represented on his voyages. Still, in 1492, most people still identified as being from their traditional kingdom. Many of the men who would end up crewing on Columbus's ships would see themselves as Castilian rather than Spanish, and their home country as being Castile. Columbus's time in Castile and the other Spanish kingdoms between 1484 and 1491 can be hard to reconstruct. But at some point in those years, he and his son Diego were taken in by the La Rábida monastery on the southern coast of Castile. This would prove to be significant for a number of reasons. Not only did the Franciscan monks of this monastery quite literally offer the wandering seafarer sanctuary, many of the brothers took an interest in his plan and actively encouraged Columbus. His relationship with the monks of Rábida may have ultimately been the key to getting his first voyage financed by the co-monarchs. Apparently, he tried in vain to pitch his idea to the Spanish court for years. A source from 1501 tells us that, quote, "For a long time, the king, queen, and all prominent men of Spain made fun of the idea," end quote. Between the years of 1486 and 1491, the plan was reviewed at least once, and possibly twice, by a group referred to in the sources as, quote, "a learned council," end quote. Like the Portuguese group who had reviewed the plan previously, they took exception with Columbus's bad math. According to historian Douglas Hunter, they also rightly pointed out that, quote, "Columbus's proposal was full of conceptual faults, among them an Earth too small in diameter and an Asia too close to the west," end quote. However, after the final conquest of Granada in 1492, the Spanish court, and in particular Queen Isabella, was in a position to take a risk on the plan. She may have been nudged in this direction by the prior of the La Rábida monastery, one Juan Perez, who acted as the queen's confessor and sometimes as her accountant. Perez advocated for Columbus and even acted as a negotiator between the mariner and the court. There's also some evidence that Isabella may have been more open to Columbus's plan because Columbus's deceased wife had actually been one of Isabella's distant cousins. In the heady days after the fall of Granada and the culmination of the centuries-long Reconquista, the court was in a jubilant mood and more ready to gamble. The turning point may have come when a key advisor to King Ferdinand, one Louis de Saint-Angel, asked Columbus exactly how much money and how many ships he would need for this adventure. When Columbus told him 3,000 pieces of gold and 2 ships, that sounded to Saint-Angel like a bargain. Even if this was a harebrained scheme, it was at least a cheap harebrained scheme that could potentially result in a huge reward. Saint-Angel's newfound enthusiasm for the plan, along with the support of the Franciscans and a small group of other influential courtiers, gave Columbus the bump he needed to get the already sympathetic Queen Isabella to agree to finance the plan. Now, there's a very old myth out there that the Queen eventually became so enthusiastic about Columbus's plan that she literally sold her jewelry in order to finance the trip. This is a total historical myth. Isabella was loaned the money to finance Columbus's voyage, but this loan came largely from a group of Genoese bankers and Saint-Angel himself, whose finances were deeply entwined with those of the Aragonese crown. So she kind of got the money from her husband's kingdom by way of a middleman. Historian Douglas Hunter also points out that Saint-Angel also gained access to wealth that had been confiscated from former Jewish subjects who had recently been expelled from Spain as part of a religious purge that accompanied the end of the Reconquista. So, at least some of the money that funded Columbus's voyages was taken by force from the Jews of Spain, who were unable or unwilling to convert to Christianity. Given how derided Columbus had been for those 7 years that he pursued the Spanish court, the deal he was about to secure with the co-monarchs was pretty incredible. In a document known as the Capitulations of Santa Fe, Columbus was given the deal of a lifetime. First, he was granted a number of lofty titles, including Admiral of the Ocean Sea, and the right to call himself Don Cristobal Colon, which identified him as a Spanish aristocrat. On top of that, he was declared Governor General and Viceroy of any new lands that he may encounter in the Indies, or any lands that he might bring into the Spanish fold while on his voyage. Finally, Columbus was granted 10% of all revenues generated by his voyage. This included any revenues generated by future voyages to the Indies that used Columbus's route. Now, that is a wild thing to get in this contract. Potentially 10% of all the trade from Asia back to Spain would theoretically belong to Columbus and his heirs. Now, why would the Spanish monarchs agree to such audacious terms? Well, it's been suggested that they simply had less experience creating these types of contracts with mariners as compared to their Portuguese contemporaries. But perhaps it also reflects the expectations for this voyage. Columbus was given letters of introduction from Ferdinand and Isabella to a person they were calling the Grand Khan, the leader that had been described by Marco Polo a century earlier. What no one in Western Europe realized at the time was that there no longer was a Grand Khan ruling China. The descendants of Genghis Khan had long since been ousted by the Ming dynasty, who had been in power in China for decades by 1492. Columbus also had a series of letters that were meant to act as formal introductions to any other, quote, princes of the Indies that Columbus might encounter. In other words, if Columbus was right, then this was essentially going to be a trade mission, not necessarily a conquest. It was highly likely that Columbus was not going to be able to claim that he was Governor General of anything, especially if he achieved his stated goal of reaching China and making contact with the Grand Khan. Now, you should know that when it became clear what Columbus had actually uncovered, this contract was heavily revised by the Spanish monarchs, who simply had the power to throw out and renegotiate anything they wanted. Still, the capitulations are key, because I think they help explain many of Columbus's decisions going forward. At the outset, Columbus's pitch had been all about the commercial prospects of this plan. Now, there were also religious concerns that I'll get into a little later, but a huge part of this was about making money. Whatever Columbus found, it was important that his backers back in Spain believed two things. One, that he had made it to Asia, or the Indies, which was the 15th century term used to designate huge swaths of East Asia. Everything from India to China to Indonesia was considered to be a part of the Indies. The capitulations made him Viceroy of the Indies, so that geography was very important to Columbus. Secondly, Columbus needed his audience to know that the places he visited were profitable. The less clear that it was that he was in the Indies, the more important it became to sell the intrinsic wealth of these places back to Spain. But there was also a religious part of the pitch. Now, there's one whole school of thought on Columbus that argues that the only way to understand him is to understand his fanatical religious convictions. This is essentially the thesis of anthropologist Carol Delaney's 2011 biography, Columbus and the Quest for Jerusalem. In the prologue to her book, Delaney argues that the key to understanding Columbus comes from a December 26, 1492 entry in his diary, where he proclaims that he will use the spoils of his voyage to finance a new crusade to the Holy Land to retake the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem. He wrote, quote, I urge your highnesses to spend all the profits of this my enterprise on the conquest of Jerusalem." End quote. Now, Delaney believes that this explains everything that Columbus does. She argues that he was deeply influenced by the apocalyptic interpretations of Scripture that were common among the Franciscan monks of the era. Remember, he was living with the Franciscan monks at the Rabida monastery. So in other words, he believed that he was living in the end times and that everything he was doing was leading up to the last judgment described in the book of Revelation. His focus was therefore not really on the new world, but on the very old world. Like many Christians of his era, he believed that Jerusalem, and specifically the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, needed to be violently retaken from the Muslims who had controlled the city of Jerusalem for centuries by that point. There was a belief that for the end times to unfold, the capture of Jerusalem needed to happen. Carol Delaney believes that this motivated Columbus's entire endeavor. It is certainly true that as Columbus's life went on, he became more of a mystic and even wrote a book in his later years guessing as to the exact date of the Last Judgment. He thought it was only about 150 years away from his own lifetime. In her biography, Delaney also emphasizes Columbus's zeal for converting people that he would eventually encounter to Christianity. In her estimation, the glory of God was the point for Columbus. However, others have challenged Delaney's interpretation. In particular, scholar Alice Bartosik-Velez has pointed out that while the conversion of pagans was always mentioned, even in the earliest versions of the capitulations, Columbus only really started leaning into the religious overtones of his voyage once he was underway. He had been cruising the Caribbean for some months before the conquest of Jerusalem ever gets mentioned in his journal. Now, there are a couple of ways we can explain this. Either Columbus became more convinced of his messianic destiny the longer he was at sea, or he realized that he needed to improve his pitch when it became clear that he hadn't found what he expected. Bartosik-Velez points out that Columbus started to cast his voyage as an extension of the Spanish Reconquista, only after a few months at sea. Her point is that Columbus may have been doing this to give his voyage a new rhetorical footing, a new raison d'etre, after he lost confidence that he was going to make contact with the Grand Khan. So it's possible that the crusade pitch was exactly that, a pitch. So, while Carol Delaney believes that Columbus was a dyed-in-the-wool crusader with his eyes firmly fixed on the Holy Land, I can't help but see him as something more akin to a startup CEO who's overpromised what his company can provide and is constantly trying to justify himself to his investors. Now, I've been told that other podcasters have made similar analogies, so my apologies if you've heard that take before. But I feel like all of Columbus's successes and crimes are best understood as the result of hasty improvisation. He was willing to do absolutely anything necessary to make himself seem successful, lest his investors abandon him and his reputation gets destroyed. Okay, but with all that context established, let's return to Columbus's first voyage and see exactly what went down in the Caribbean in 1492. In part one of this series, I casually asserted that in this day and age it was fairly well accepted that Christopher Columbus did not actually discover anything. In that last episode, I didn't really justify that position. I just presented it as a given. Sure enough, there were some listeners that felt like I needed to back that up a little bit more. After all, wasn't it well understood that Columbus's voyages inaugurated a new era of European colonialism across the Atlantic? Had Columbus not proven to Europe that land existed in corners of the globe previously unimagined? Doesn't that count as a discovery of sorts? Can we not say that from a European perspective, these lands were, quote-unquote, discovered? The reason that I have fairly carefully avoided the term discovery to describe Columbus's exploits in the Caribbean is because I find that word to be deeply misleading. When Columbus's ships arrived in 1492, they discovered a Caribbean thickly populated with human beings, living in settlements large and small, practicing agriculture, engaging in trade, worshiping gods, speculating on philosophy, fussing over local politics, and making art. You simply cannot discover a place that has been inhabited by and changed by the culture of millions of people for millennia. To say that Columbus discovered these places is to willfully ignore the experience, culture, and achievements of indigenous people. It suggests a version of world history that's simply wrong. It suggests that these places were unknown to humanity until they were seen by European eyes. So no, Columbus did not discover anything. There's also some good evidence that Columbus and his crew weren't even the first Europeans to make it to the Western Hemisphere. Now, this is a topic that I want to explore more deeply in a future series, so I don't want to get too into the weeds here. But there is archaeology and a handful of Norse sagas describing trips to a place known as Vinland that have been used to make a very compelling case that the Norse likely arrived and built a settlement on the northern peninsula of Newfoundland around 1000 AD, nearly 500 years before Columbus. Now, I am aware that there continues to be some debate around this, and believe me, I really want to dig into this in the future. But even if we're going to essentialize European landings in the Western Hemisphere, I would be remiss if I didn't point out that Columbus was likely beaten to the punch on that account as well. But with all that said, the 1492 arrival of Columbus's fleet was enormously important in world historical terms. Just because this was not a discovery does not mean that it didn't radically transform the world in all sorts of completely unforeseen ways. It was a turning point, and that shouldn't be diminished. The first landing made by Columbus and his crew on October 12, 1492, was somewhere in the island chain we now call the Bahamas. He would dub the island where he made his first landfall San Salvador. However, there continues to be debate around which Bahamian island this actually was. The island that is today called San Salvador conspicuously changed its name in the 1920s in hopes of shoring up a local tradition that it was, in fact, Columbus's true first landing place. There are a handful of other Bahamian islands that also claim that distinction. But given Columbus's famously hazy navigation records, the exact location remains a little unclear. In fact, everything that we read in Christopher Columbus's journal needs to be handled with care. First, it needs to be understood that the journal was written with an audience in mind. This was to be an official account that would justify and explain his efforts to the Spanish royals. In fact, he addresses the royals directly throughout the journal. The journal was, in many ways, a continuation of his sales pitch. The other complicating factor is that the journal has not come down to us in its original form. What we get from the journal is quoted at length in later histories. Some of these histories, like the one written by Columbus's son, Ferdinand, were very complimentary to the Admiral. Whereas our other key source for the journal, the history written by Bartolomé Las Casas, a historian later distinguished for his advocacy for indigenous people, was considerably more critical of Columbus. Believe me, we will have more on Las Casas later. The point is, the version of Columbus's journal that we can read went through a number of scribes before it came into the hands of those historians. And from there, it was subject to those writers' particular choices as to what to include and what to omit. So I guess what I'm telling you is that there really is no real account of Columbus's first voyage, just interpretations of interpretations. Nevertheless, there is still much that can be learned. What is clear is that when he arrived, Columbus immediately encountered people. The island he chose to call San Salvador was called Guanahani by the local Lucanian people. Columbus's landing party was met on the beach by a large crowd of curious but friendly islanders. Almost immediately, the two groups started engaging in trade. The Lucanian folks brought the visitors skeins of cotton and colorful trained parrots, for which they received red caps, glass beads, and hawk's bells, which are literally bells that were attached to the feet of hunting birds. Now, these hawk's bells would later become a symbol of the excesses of Columbus's regime, so keep those particular trinkets in mind. So who were these people? Well, if the name Lucanian isn't familiar to you, it's because it wasn't ever used by the Spanish. In fact, many of the original tribal names of these groups were ignored. We know now that on this first voyage, Columbus encountered many diverse groups of people who were linked by a common Arawak language. Eventually, the Spanish took to identifying a large swath of these Arawak-speaking people as Taínos. Now, the origins of that word are somewhat unclear. It may have been a Spanish corruption of an Arawak phrase or a complete Spanish invention. The word was used to denote the quote-unquote good men or, quote, noble people of the islands. But you should know that the word Taíno was not originally used by indigenous people to self-identify. Columbus's journal, or at least the version of Columbus's journal that we get, records all sorts of observations about these people that he encountered. At times, he was admiring. At other times, he was completely culture shocked. He would marvel at how the first group of people he met, quote, all go around as naked as their mothers bore them, end quote. He would go on to comment that, quote, they are well built with very handsome bodies and good faces, end quote. But he also very quickly assessed how these people might be conquered. He noted that, quote, they have no iron, they bear no arms, nor are they acquainted with them. For I showed them swords, and they grasped them by the blade, and cut themselves through ignorance, end quote. Columbus was sizing them up. You see, almost immediately after first contact, the Admiral noted that there were two types of people inhabiting this region that he was sure was the Indies. There were these gentle, welcoming folks, and there was an aggressive group. In the journal, he recorded, quote, many of the men I have seen have scars on their bodies, and when I made signs to them to find out how this happened, they indicated that people from other nearby islands come to San Salvador to capture them. They defend themselves the best they can. I believe that people from the mainland come here to take them as slaves, end quote. This rumored aggressive group would eventually be referred to in Columbus's journal as the Caniba. As he traveled, he would record more rumors about how the Caniba allegedly ate human flesh. And yes, the English word cannibal seems to have been rooted in Columbus's description of this group. Now, eventually, the so-called Caniba would be identified as the Caribs, another large cultural group from that region. Now, there is a huge debate among experts around how reliable these stories of cannibalism actually are. This is something I want to explore in an extra episode for the patrons. It's possible that the idea that the Caribs were cannibals was actually an historical myth. But to draw a thoughtful conclusion on that, I want to break down all the evidence in more detail. So if you're interested in that, please check out the extra episode that will be available through Patreon once this trilogy is over. But here's what I'll say for now. This distinction between the good and noble Taínos and the evil flesh-eating Caniba or Caribs would eventually be exploited by the Spanish and used to justify the enslavement of countless human beings. Columbus's account of this very first encounter with the people of Guanahani foreshadows this eventual outcome. He summed up his first encounter by concluding that the people, quote, ought to be good servants and of good intelligence. I believe they would easily be made Christian, for it seemed to me that they had no religion. Our Lord pleasing, I will carry off 6 of them at my departure, for your highnesses, that they may learn to speak, end quote. Now that particular passage from the journal gets quoted a lot because it establishes right out of the gate how Columbus saw the people that he had encountered. He appraised their defensive capacity and took note of the fact that they did not have iron weapons. Columbus would later gain a certain appreciation for indigenous spiritual beliefs, believe it or not, but at this moment he was happy to conclude that they had no religion and would easily accept Christianity. Finally, he fairly casually concludes that the people of this region can and should be made into servants. Now, the goal of Columbus's voyage was never explicitly to conquer or enslave anyone. He was there to meet the Grand Khan and set up a new trade route. But immediately, Columbus sized up his hosts and concluded that he could enslave them. And to really hammer that point home, he forcefully rounded up a handful of people and made them his prisoners, quote, so that they might learn to speak, end quote. Now, for the record, this first group of captives would all end up escaping Columbus's clutches at the next landfall. But this was just the start of the Admiral taking people by force whenever he deemed it useful. Now, why do this? Well, the more I've read, the more it seems to me that Columbus was desperate to show signs of success at every turn. The people were evidence that he had made it to the Indies. If he found nothing else of value, he had found potential Christian converts and potential slaves. So he was eager to show that. Nevertheless, the journal also has moments where Columbus seems genuinely in awe and overwhelmed by the place he was encountering. Cruising the Bahamas is a famously nice thing to do, and Columbus was not impervious to the region's many charms. As he sailed, he continued to trade and learn about the local people. And over the course of the next 2 months, he would chart a course that would take him from the Bahamas to the north coast of Cuba. Now, given Cuba's impressively long coastline, he concluded that it could not possibly be an island. It was rather a huge peninsula extending from the Asian mainland. This, he thought, was surely the territory of the Great Khan. And yet, despite this stubborn belief, Columbus also went through the ritual of taking possession of everything he encountered for the Spanish crown. Now, once again, I'm going to quote from the author Kirkpatrick Sale, who I think does a good job of underscoring the odd cognitive dissonance of this entire endeavor. He writes, quote, "Why would the Admiral assume that these territories were unpossessed, even by those clearly inhabiting them, and thus available for Spain to claim? Why would he not think twice about the possibility that some considerable potentate, the Grand Khan of China, for example, whom he later acknowledged on November 6, must be the ruler of the island of Hispaniola, that's modern Haiti and the Dominican Republic, might descend upon him at any moment with a greater military force and punish him for his territorial presumption? Why would he make the ceremony of possession his very first act on shore? No European would have imagined that anyone, 3 small boatloads of Indians, say, could come up to a European shore or island and take possession of it. Nor would a European imagine marching up to some part of North Africa or the Middle East and claiming sovereignty with impunity. Why were these lands thought to be different? End quote. That passage really resonated with me because these are excellent questions, and there really aren't any clear answers. How did he think he could get away with any of this if he truly thought he was in the Indies? The best I can puzzle is that Columbus was hedging his bets. He wanted these lands to be the land of the Khan, but just in case they weren't, he was going to still make sure that he got paid. If he could return to Spain claiming that he had enlarged the empire, well, that could do much to silence any complaints that he had not actually reached Asia. If his claims to possession were later challenged by the Great Khan or some other Asian prince, then so be it. But in the meantime, he couldn't be accused of returning empty-handed. Or at least, that's my guess. The Journal of the First Voyage has a few key passages that hint at Columbus's later callous attitude towards this region and its people. But it also contains many passages that suggest that this encounter between the hemispheres could have unfolded quite differently. The Genoese explorer was often overwhelmed by the beauty of the places and the people he was seeing for the first time. Despite those damning passages where he sizes up the local people as potential servants and slaves, he also writes glowingly about their kindness, manners, the structure of their society, and even the quality of their food. In one particularly emotional passage, he gushed that the indigenous people he had met were, quote, people of love and without greed and suitable to every purpose. I assure your highnesses that in all the world there is no better people and no better country. They love their neighbors as themselves and have the sweetest talk in the world and are gentle and always with a smile. End quote. He could see their humanity, which makes some of his later actions all the more upsetting. However, the perceived success of the Enterprise, as he called his mission, was always paramount. And even before the first voyage was over, many of Columbus's weaknesses as a leader would become very clear. But let's take a quick break, and when we return, we'll take a look at the chaotic end of the first voyage. Columbus traveled along the north coast of Cuba west until he became satisfied that it couldn't possibly be an island and was surely a peninsula sticking out from the mainland of Asia. He then decided to turn the flotilla around and have them head back east. This would eventually take them to the island that would in time become the most important location for the rest of the Columbus story. This is the island that Columbus dubbed Hispaniola, and today contains the two nations of Haiti and the Dominican Republic. But this was the part of the voyage where everything really started to go wrong. It's not nearly as well known as it should be how close Columbus's first voyage came to completely collapsing. Throughout the first voyage, Columbus relied heavily on the sailing acumen and leadership of the Pinzon brothers, the owners and captains of the Pinta and Nina. But, as will become a recurring theme in Columbus's life, the Admiral had a way of alienating key subordinates. On November 21st, 1492, the Pinta, captained by Martin Pinzon, broke away from the rest of the fleet and started charting its own course around the Caribbean. Now, it's been debated if this was simply the result of a miscommunication or an act of direct insubordination, perhaps even a low-key mutiny. It's possible that the initial separation of the Pinta was a mistake, but the captain's choice to plot his own course separate from Columbus for the next month was clearly no accident. Any way you sliced it, Columbus was losing control of his voyage. But the most dramatic moment of all would come on Christmas Day, when Columbus lost the Santa Maria. And again, I feel like this aspect of the voyage is underreported. I feel like people don't always know that the Santa Maria was shipwrecked and never returned to Spain. So, what exactly happened here? Well, the original story was that after a few weeks of exploring the coast of the island he was now calling Hispaniola, Columbus became increasingly excited at the prospect that the island might contain huge sources of gold. Throughout the voyage, Columbus had noted every hint of gold with great interest. Many of the people he encountered in both the Bahamas and in Cuba wore small pieces of gold jewelry, and many were willing to trade them with the Spanish. But when the fleet finally made it to the island of Hispaniola, Columbus was delighted to discover that the welcoming inhabitants of the island seemed to have slightly more gold than many of their neighbors. Further, Columbus was told that a local ruler, or cacique, by the name of Guanacari, was eager to meet him and would happily provide gold for trade. Or at least, that was how Columbus interpreted what was being said to him through a conversation that was largely being done through improvised sign language. Still, this good news came right around Christmas Eve, and so Columbus allowed for a bit of a celebration to take place into Christmas Day. We're told that night, Columbus, who had apparently not slept for 2 days, judged the weather to be calm, so he finally put his head down to rest. The ship's pilot apparently had the same idea. Exhausted and likely partied out, he decided to get some rest as well and made the fateful decision to put a cabin boy in charge of steering the Santa Maria. Sure enough, this poor kid hit a shallow reef, grounding the flagship. Within a few hours, the planking had opened up, and by the next day, the Santa Maria had sunk. The crew was rescued by the Nina and then taken in by the helpful and hospitable Guanacari. So, on Christmas Day, 1492, Columbus, who had started with 3 ships, was now down to 1. But the way that he reacted to this moment is what makes him unique as a historical figure. This man refused to accept a setback. In fact, this may have been one of his defining characteristics. After openly weeping for days over this disastrous turn of events, Columbus completely changed his perspective. He now saw the hand of God in all of this. God had willed the Santa Maria to be destroyed so Columbus could build the first European settlement in the hemisphere. Or at least, that's what the Admiral insisted. And so, that's exactly what he set about doing. He ordered that his men salvage everything they possibly could from the Santa Maria and build a fort on a nearby promontory. He would dub the new settlement Navidad in honor of the Christmas shipwreck. The construction of Navidad would also coincide with Columbus's first proper meeting with Guanacari, a man who, for better or ill, would become Columbus's first North American ally. Guanacari clearly understood that the European visitors could be powerful and influential allies in their own right, and so he did his best to ingratiate himself to Columbus. To this end, he gifted the Admiral a number of large gold ornaments, including a few large plates of gold, a gold mask, and a gold necklace. These gold gifts convinced Columbus that Hispaniola was clearly rich with the precious metal, which would convince him to once again move the goalposts for success on this voyage. This shifting of priorities would also lead Columbus to revise his account of the shipwreck. He would eventually write a version of the story that had nothing to do with a Christmas Eve party and an irresponsible decision to put a cabin boy at the helm. In the revised version, Columbus would claim that the disaster struck entirely because of the treachery of the ship's master, who disobeyed a direct order from Columbus to drag the anchor, which presumably could have helped avert the sinking of the ship. Historian Lawrence Berg-Green has pointed out that this new version of the story was cooked up to make the accident appear more divinely ordained. In this fabricated version of events, Columbus was subtly likening himself to Christ. Like the Savior, he was betrayed by a lesser man, but ultimately this was for the greater good of serving God's plan. The plan, according to Columbus, was for him to establish something permanent in the New World. He would later write that before the sinking of the Santa Maria, quote, he always went with the intention to discover and not tarry in a place more than one day, end quote. Now he realized that God wanted him to set down roots. That was the real goal of the mission all along. So the shipwreck wasn't a disaster, it was the ultimate sign of success. Or at least that is what he was selling. With the Santa Maria lost and the Pinta charting a potentially mutinous course, Columbus needed to get back to Spain. And once there, he needed to spin all of this into a massive success. So Columbus hatched a plan. He would leave 39 men behind in Navidad, ostensibly under the protection of his new ally, Guanacari. Now, the beauty part of this plan was that Columbus now had a very clear and pressing reason to return to these lands. This was part of the pitch for a second voyage. There were 39 Castilian men marooned on the island of Hispaniola. At the very least, Columbus needed to return to rescue them. Right, guys? After striking this deal with Guanacari, Columbus set out on the Niña back towards Spain. A few days later, the Pinta pulled back into sight. After a fairly heated exchange, where one source tells us that Columbus even threatened to hang Martin Pinzon, the parties were able to reach enough of a détente that they agreed to sail together back to Spain. The homeward passage would prove to be considerably more intense than the voyage west. But despite violent storms and a brief interlude where some of his crew were arrested by the Portuguese authorities, Columbus managed to return to the port of Palos on March 15th, 1493. Columbus's return to Spain after his first voyage was undoubtedly the high point of his life. He was given a true hero's welcome. A month after he returned, he was received at court in Barcelona, where he paraded through the streets like a returning conqueror. In front of him were led half a dozen indigenous people, dressed in as many gold ornaments as Columbus could manage. It was a spectacle that was meant to sell the entire undertaking as an unmitigated success. When Columbus returned, he quickly published a letter to the Spanish sovereigns outlining what he had achieved on his first voyage. That letter was soon circulated all around Europe and was read by great interests by pretty much anyone who was literate at the time. In the letter, Columbus claimed that he had made it to Asia, specifically claiming that he had entered the, quote, Ocean of India when he encountered the Bahamas. But perhaps to offset the disappointment that he had not contacted the Grand Khan, nor located Cathay, China, or Cipango, Japan, he instead spent much of his letter detailing the many riches of the island of Hispaniola. The sovereigns couldn't be disappointed because he found them an island filled with gold, an island that he assured them could be easily conquered, filled with people who would quickly become Christians and could be compelled to, quote, search for and gather and give to us what they abound in, and we greatly need, end quote. The thing that they abounded in, and the Spanish greatly needed, was, of course, gold. And Columbus quite clearly suggested that the people of the island could be compelled to get it for them. The pitch for a second voyage had already started, but Columbus's need to spin every aspect of this voyage into a roaring success had turned what was supposed to be a trade mission to Asia into a plan for conquest. His gambit to leave a group of men in Navidad also paid dividends, as many in Spain were persuaded that Columbus needed to return to Hispaniola as soon as possible to relieve these marooned men. The speed at which a second voyage was organized speaks to just how effective Columbus's pitch truly was. In particular, the promise of gold on Hispaniola motivated a whole new cadre of supporters and hangers-on to volunteer to join the Admiral of the Ocean Sea. Going on a voyage with Columbus was no longer seen as a risky venture that at most might net some new trade revenue. This was a get-rich-quick scheme. Columbus knew the way to an island that he assured everyone was filled with gold. But the dark truth was that Hispaniola was not particularly rich in gold, or at least not as rich in gold as Columbus's sales pitch had suggested. Keeping up the fiction of Hispaniola's immeasurable wealth would eventually lead to Columbus's most unforgivable crimes. By September of 1493, Columbus was again set to return to the Caribbean, except this time he was not commanding a fleet of 3 modest ships. Columbus would return with 17 ships, carrying 1,500 people. We're talking soldiers, priests, carpenters, stonemasons, metal workers, and farmers. This was no trade delegation. This was an invasion force. Okay, that's all for this week. Join us again in 2 weeks' time when we will conclude our trilogy on Columbus. And man, I got so much to talk about still. I have a feeling that third part's going to be a beast. But hey, it's an important story, and I hope you've been enjoying it so far. Before we go this week, I need to give a special shout out to the following people. Big ups to Dank McSwaggins, to Conrad Norman III, to Johann Karl, to Connor Mangan, to Josh Brown, to Omer Stern, to Sydney Steiner, to Ronnie Hansen, to Barry Johnson, to Brian Johnson, to Donate You Won't. I like that one. To Eric Riggins, to Don Watts, to Monica S., and to Figoa. All of those folks have decided to pledge at $5 or more every month on Patreon, so you know what that means. They are beautiful human beings. Thank you, thank you, thank you for your support. Thank you to everyone who supports at all levels. As I was mentioning throughout the show today, I'm going to have an all-new extra episode out for patrons once this Columbus trilogy has concluded. There's just so much stuff that I know you guys are going to be interested in that I just couldn't get into the regularly scheduled episodes. So patrons, keep your eye out for a new extra episode when the trilogy's over. If you think that you want to hear that extra episode and all the other great extras that are available through Patreon, please go to patreon.com/OurFakeHistory. If you don't got money to support the show, I get it. That's fine. Maybe just leave a nice 5-star review of the podcast somewhere, or just recommend it to a friend. That stuff helps. If you want to get in touch with me, you can always send me a message at ourfakehistory@gmail.com. You can hit me up on Facebook at facebook.com/ourfakehistory. You can find me on Twitter at ourfakehistory. You can find me on Instagram at ourfakehistory. And now you can find me on TikTok at ourfakehistory, as well as on YouTube at, of course, ourfakehistory. I'm everywhere, baby. Reach on out. Check out the stuff I'm doing on all those platforms. As always, the theme music for the show comes to us from Dirty Church. You can check out Dirty Church at dirtychurch.bandcamp.com. And all the other music you heard on the show today was written and recorded by me. My name is Sebastian Major. And remember, just because it didn't happen doesn't mean it isn't real.